Coming to get you, Barbara.
And now for something a bit different. One thing about the zombie horror genre is that even though it goes back a long, long way, it's almost impossible to review or talk about modern zombie movies without making comparisons or references to the Dead series by George A. Romero, particularly the original Night of the Living Dead. And before I talk about 28 Days Later, I'd like to talk about Night of the Living Dead again. I mentioned early on in this feature that there are basically two types of zombies: the reanimated dead and living zombies, which are usually people who are under hypnosis or some kind of spell. 28 Days Later seems to introduce a third type, but in a way it's sort of a mixture of both. In Night of the Living Dead and its sequels, we never find out what causes the dead to rise. There's been numerous theories, but Romero likes to keep it a mystery, and when people ask him about it, he says he doesn't know. In Night of the Living Dead, it's theorized that radiation from a satellite caused the zombie outbreak, but not everyone agrees on it. In the sequels, several other theories are put forward, but no one is any better than the other for the most part. But one theory that I've always thought was the truth is that it's an infection, a blood-borne virus that takes control of a dead brain and animates the body. It makes perfect sense after all. It does everything a virus would do. It feeds itself by making the dead eat people. It propagates itself by infecting others through bites, and as it controls the dead person's brain, it loses control of the body once the brain is destroyed. In later Dead films, the zombies got smarter, and this could be the virus adapting and evolving. What's scary is that there's a real-life version of this. Actually, there's several. There's a virus that turns caterpillars into zombies, a fungus that turns ants into zombies, and a parasite that turns fish into zombies. 28 Days Later is an interesting film because it's sort of the anti-zombie movie. Like the Dead films, the word zombie is never used, and like my favorite theory about the Dead films, everything is caused by a virus, which is called rage in this case. However, the victims in this case are alive and can be killed in any fashion. They don't eat people or brains, but they do attack people on sight and bite them viciously. Basically, it's what a person would act like if they were consumed by rage, hence the name. But while eventually normal people calm down, these guys are in overdrive constantly. And believe it or not, the rage virus does indeed also have a real-life counterpart, bovine spongiform encephalitis, or mad cow disease, which basically turns cows into the infected from 28 Days Later. While humans can get sick from eating the tainted meat, thankfully we don't turn into rage-fueled zombies, but instead we get Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, which, well, actually it just sucks just as bad. Now that I've scared the shit out of you, let's talk about the plot of the movie. The movie starts with some eco-terrorists breaking into a primate research and testing facility to free a bunch of chimps. A scientist catches them, but they hold the man at gunpoint. He pleads with them to not free the chimps, stating that they are infected and highly contagious, but they don't listen to him and they free the chimps, who attack and infect everybody. 28 days later, all of Great Britain has been consumed by the virus, and there have been reports of the infection spreading throughout Europe and even across the Atlantic. Upon infection, which can either come from a bite or by an infected person getting anything more than skin contact with even a single drop of infected blood, you go crazy in less than a minute, and there's no cure. A young man named Jim wakes up in a hospital 28 days after the first outbreak and finds the hospital and the city itself completely devoid of people. I never knew of a hospital that has its coma patients sleeping in the nude with no covers, but hey, I guess it's just fan service for the ladies and certain dudes out there. So if you want to see Cillian Murphy's Wang, it's there. And if you don't, I'm giving you fair warning. Anyway, Jim wanders around London looking for people. He has no idea what happened because before the outbreak he was hit by a car and went into a coma. I assume that everybody in the hospital was killed or abandoned it and that he was probably left alone by the infected because maybe they figured he was dead already. Maybe they only react to movement, who knows. Anyway, Jim eventually winds up in a church where he finds a mountain of dead bodies and is first attacked by the infected. They chase him through the streets, and he's rescued by two other survivors who firebomb the infected. They bring him back to their safe house and introduce themselves as Selena and Mark. Jim gets them to come along with him to find his parents, who they assure him are almost certainly dead, and they're right, only thankfully they had killed themselves peacefully before they could be either infected or killed by the infected, and left him a note. While at the apartment, they're attacked again by infected, and Mark gets bit, which causes Selina to immediately cut him down with a machete. She explains how the infection works and assures Jim that if he gets infected, she'll do the same to him. Selina seems cold and brutal, and it's understandable given the circumstances. She's a survivor for a reason, but throughout the movie, she does seem to regain her humanity and soften up a bit. On the way back, they notice some Christmas lights out in an apartment building, which is unusual because there hasn't been any electricity for days. Reasoning there might be more survivors, they travel to the apartment building, but as they're climbing up the stairs, they're attacked again. They're rescued by another survivor named Frank and his teenage daughter Hannah. Frank is bright and cheerful and happy to see other living, non-infected people, but the next day he tells them that his supplies are dwindling and that they should leave the city and go to the country where there is bound to be less infected roaming around. He even has a destination, an army base outside of Manchester. A recorded and constantly rebroadcast message he picked up on a radio says all survivors should head there and that they have the answer to infection. Jim wants to check it out, but Selina thinks Frank and Hannah will slow her down, but Jim points out that she really has no plans other than surviving and that this is their best bet, but it's actually Hannah who convinces her that they need to stick together. The trip isn't all that eventful, except for the bit where they're attacked by more infected in a tunnel while having a flat tire, but this is where the movie is starting to change. What starts off as a typical zombie horror movie is becoming something different, and there's more focus on the characters, scenery, and soundtrack than before. When they arrive at the army base, they find it deserted. Frank gets infected by a drop of blood from a corpse and starts attacking them, but is cut down by soldiers who pop up out of nowhere. It seems they had moved their base of operations and were scouting the area. At first it seems that they're rescued and everything is fine now, but this is only halfway into the movie. The soldiers are all very young men who are trying to rebuild civilization. They have electricity and running water and come off as a bunch of goofballs, but are pretty damn safe, having plenty of weapons and ammunition, and have littered the surrounding area with landmines. The answer to infection isn't a cure, however, but to just hole up and wait for the infected to starve to death. One of the soldiers has been infected, and instead of killing him, they manage to capture him and chain him down, where they wait to see how long he lasts before dying. It seems cruel, but it also makes sense in a way. Anyway, you might notice something is a bit off about the soldiers, and it all becomes clear before too long. After fending off an attack by the infected, a few of them get a little too frisky with Selina. Jim goes to talk to the sergeant in charge, West, basically saying, hey look, we're grateful and all, but the lady said no, and we can't have that kind of thing going on. The sergeant then basically tells Jim that he fully intends to let his men have their way with both Selina and, disturbingly enough, Hannah, reasoning that humanity is on the brink of extinction and they need to propagate the species. But it's a thin excuse, and he pretty much just says that it's to boost his men's morale. It's then that Sergeant West's true colors are shown, but if you're thinking about it, it was pretty obvious. At the dinner scene earlier, he claims the world is no different. It's just people killing people, and it's always been that way and will always be that way. This makes him sound deep and insightful if you're an idiot. People who claim human nature is rotten claim that because they themselves are rotten, and instead of admitting to themselves and others that they're rotten, they try to escape responsibility for their thoughts and actions by claiming that it's human nature. They can't help it. Sergeant West's basic philosophy is to take advantage of the anarchy created by the total collapse of society and indulge his baser desires, and to convince other people that these desires are normal. West tells Jim that he created the radio broadcast to lure women in so they could be made into sexual slaves, and invites him to join his new society of rapists, but of course Jim refuses and attempts to take Selina and Hannah and escape. However, they're captured pretty quickly. Too bad he didn't play it cool and pretend to join them and escape later on. One of the soldiers thinks this whole thing is pretty fucked up and dissents against West, but he too is captured. The soldier, Farrell, reasons that West is insane, and there is in fact no global epidemic of the rage virus, reasoning that viruses can't travel across large bodies of water, and the infection turns people into zombies so quickly that it's not like somebody can just carry it on a plane. He claims that Great Britain has been quarantined, and that the other nations are probably fine. Pretty soon they take Jim and Farrell outside to be executed, and while they kill Farrell, Jim gets away and goes over the wall. They don't bother looking for him because they figure being outside the wall with the infected and with no weapons, he won't last long. So they return to base where they're preparing the girls for a lifetime of being violated by forcing them to dress up. Selena tries to feed Hannah enough Vicodin for her to overdose, sparing the young girl the indignity of being repeatedly sexually assaulted, but the soldiers stop her before she can swallow enough pills, so she merely winds up being stoned for most of the rest of the movie. Jim returns to take his revenge and rescue the ladies, and he does this by freeing the infected man they had captured and letting him tear through the drunken, horny idiots. They escape, but Jim gets shot. Now, if you're watching this on DVD, it has a few different endings, most of them ending with Jim dead. But the theatrical version has Selena managing to save him at a hospital, and he awakens 28 days later. A Finnish jet comes overhead, and they manage to get its attention, basically being rescued, and confirming the theory that the outbreak was limited to Great Britain. There was later a sequel, 28 weeks later, which explains everything further, but also shows that the infection does breach into France. 28 Days Later is a great movie. It's a horror movie with a crazy new type of zombie, and it's very effective at this. But what makes it really good is that it goes beyond just that. Just about at the point when the movie starts to slow down because the whole infected horror angle isn't going to go any further, they change tactics completely, and at the end you're rooting for the zombies to kill the soldiers. The film has great images and sounds, and I really have to praise the soundtrack, which is probably the best part of the movie. It does a great job of setting the mood. For the most part, the acting is quite good. The only actor that I'd criticize would be Megan Burns, who plays Hannah. She's clearly not cut out to be an actress, as she's blank and expressionless for most of the movie. Though this does work for the later half when she's mourning her father, or stoned on Vicodin, she basically acts like that throughout the entire movie. Thankfully, it doesn't detract too much from the overall experience, and it seems that she's given up acting for a singing career anyway. 28 Days Later is anything but a traditional zombie film, but in a lot of ways it revitalized the genre. It seems that there were plenty of zombie movies in the 70s and the 80s, but in the 90s no one gave a shit about zombies except in video games. There weren't many original zombie movies in that decade, only remakes like the 1990 version of Night of the Living Dead, and sequels to established series like Return of the Living Dead and Reanimator. The only original zombie movie from the 90s that I can think of off the top of my head would be Dead Alive, one of the goriest movies ever. But I'm not covering that one this time around, and no, I don't need you to list 90s zombie movies, of course they're out there, but my point was that in the 90s zombies went out of fashion in a sense. And in a lot of ways, 28 Days Later was the movie that brought them back, even though it wasn't a traditional zombie movie by any means. In the next year or so, we'd get the movie version of Resident Evil and a remake of Dawn of the Dead that would really kick things into high gear. But I'll be talking about those soon enough. For now, I'm going to give 28 Days Later the rating it deserves, a 9 out of 10.